I caught my brother's wife sneaking into my dad's room. What I found changed our family forever. Have you ever walked into a situation that completely shattered everything you thought you knew about your family? I certainly didn't expect it. But what I discovered about my brother's wife and what was going on behind closed doors changed my entire family forever. Before we dive into today's story, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now, let's jump right into the story. It all started one quiet evening when I was staying at my parents' house after a long week at work. I had decided to visit and spend some time with the family, something I hadn't done in a while. My brother and his wife Melanie were also there for the weekend. It was a typical family gathering, nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. Around midnight, I was getting ready to head to bed when I noticed something strange. I heard faint footsteps in the hallway, and when I peeked out of my room, I saw Melanie walking down the stairs. At first, I assumed she was just getting a glass of water or checking on something in the kitchen, but what happened next was far from ordinary. Instead of heading to the kitchen, Melanie walked straight toward my dad's room. My heart skipped a beat as I watched her stand outside the door for a moment. She seemed to hesitate, glancing around as if she was making sure no one was watching, and then, in the dead of night, she opened the door and slipped inside. I was frozen in shock. Why on earth would she be going into my dad's room? There were no legitimate reasons that made sense in my mind, especially considering that my father was an elderly man, and Melanie had no real reason to visit him at such a late hour. My mind started racing with 1,000 different questions, each more troubling than the last. I quietly crept down the hallway and waited in the shadows, unsure of what to do next. I debated whether I should confront her right then and there or let it go. But my instincts told me something was very wrong. I couldn't just stand by and let whatever was happening go unchecked. Minutes later, I heard faint murmurs coming from the room. I couldn't make out the words, but it was clear that there was a conversation going on. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. After what seemed like an eternity, Melanie finally emerged from the room. She looked flustered, her face flushed as if she had been caught in the act. She glanced around, probably trying to gauge if anyone had noticed her unusual behavior, and quickly hurried down the hall to her room. She didn't even look back. I stood there in the hallway, utterly stunned. What in the world had just happened? I had no idea what was going on in that room, but something told me that I needed to find out. But how? Should I confront her, or should I approach my dad and ask him directly? I stood there for a few moments longer, trying to make sense of everything. I had so many questions, but I was too scared to ask. What was Melanie hiding, and why had she been sneaking into my dad's room at night? The next morning, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. The way Melanie had slipped into my dad's room so quietly, the unease I felt as I watched her leave. It was all just too strange. I knew I had to get to the bottom of it. But how was I supposed to approach this? I couldn't just ask her outright, especially not after what had happened the night before. It was clear that something was going on, but I had no idea what. I spent the morning trying to act normal, chatting with the family, pretending like everything was fine. But every time Melanie entered the room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of suspicion bubbling up inside me. I kept glancing at her, wondering what she was thinking, what she was hiding. The tension in the air was thick, but no one seemed to notice. As the day went on, I decided to take a more subtle approach. I needed answers, but I couldn't just confront her directly. Instead, I would start by asking my dad. I knew he wasn't always the most open with details, especially when it came to matters concerning the family, but I had to try. I needed to know if he had any idea why Melanie had been sneaking into his room the night before. That afternoon, while we were all sitting in the living room, I asked if he wanted to go for a walk. It was the perfect excuse to get some privacy, and I figured I could ask him in a casual, nonchalant way. He agreed, and we headed outside. As we walked down the driveway, I tried to ease into the topic. "Hey, Dad," I began, keeping my tone light. "I saw something last night, and I was wondering if you could help me make sense of it." He looked at me curiously, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean, son?" he asked, his voice soft and concerned. I hesitated for a moment, not wanting to jump to conclusions, but knowing I had to ask. "Well, I saw Melanie go into your room last night, around midnight. She was in there for a while, and it seemed like she was being secretive about it." My dad stopped walking and turned to face me. His expression immediately changed from casual to serious, and I could tell that he was deep in thought. "What are you talking about, son?" he asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "Melanie came into my room, are you sure?" I nodded, feeling a pit form in my stomach. Yes, I'm sure. I was just wondering what was going on. You know, if everything's okay between you two. There was a long silence as my dad seemed to process what I had said. His eyes shifted away from mine, and I could see the gears turning in his head. Finally, he spoke again, but his words only raised more questions. I don't think you should worry about it, son, he said, his voice sounding evasive. Melanie and I have some things we've been talking about, but it's nothing for you to concern yourself with. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as he spoke. His response was vague, and there was a hint of something else in his tone, a sort of guardedness, as if he didn't want to reveal too much. It was then that I realized that something was definitely not right. I pressed further, not satisfied with his answer. Dad, it's just, I've never seen you two act like this before, and I'm worried. You know I'm here for you, right? If there's anything going on, I want to help. His eyes met mine, and for a moment it seemed like he was going to tell me the truth. But then, just as quickly, the wall went back up. He gave me a forced smile and clapped me on the shoulder. Thanks, son, but really, it's nothing. Just forget about it. But I couldn't forget. Not now. Something wasn't adding up, and I knew I had to find out what it was. I couldn't let this go. The questions in my mind were growing louder by the minute, and I couldn't rest until I had answers. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Melanie off the hook so easily. I had to confront her directly, and I had to do it tonight. That evening, after dinner, I made sure to slip away quietly. I didn't want to draw any attention to myself as I waited for the right moment to speak with Melanie. I knew she was still on edge from earlier, and I could feel that something was off. But the more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I had to know what was going on between her and my dad, even if it meant uncovering something I wasn't ready to hear. I waited for a while, pacing the living room and trying to gather my thoughts. It wasn't until late in the evening that I saw her slipping toward the back door, her footsteps soft on the hardwood. She was trying to sneak out again, just like before. I felt my heart race as I followed her quietly through the hallway, not making a sound. I had to confront her now. When she reached the door, I stepped forward and called her name. Melanie, I said, my voice firm but not angry. We need to talk. She froze, her hand still resting on the doorknob, and then turned to face me. Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment, I thought she might try to deny everything. But instead, she simply sighed and lowered her gaze. Is this about last night? She asked quietly, her voice shaky. Because I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So, it was about last night. My suspicions were right. I knew there was something between them, but I never imagined it would be this complicated. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to her, trying to remain calm despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Melanie, I need to know what's going on. My dad, he's not telling me everything. I saw you in his room, and now you're acting strange. I can't just pretend like everything's normal. She looked up at me then, her face filled with guilt. For a moment, she didn't say anything, as if she were trying to decide whether to open up to me or not. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and hesitant. It's complicated, she said, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. Your dad and I have been going through some stuff. He's been dealing with a lot, and I didn't want to burden you with it. I was starting to feel a sense of relief. She was finally admitting that something was going on, even if she wasn't being completely open yet. But I still had so many questions. What kind of stuff? Why didn't you just tell me? I'm your family, Melanie. I should know. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she wiped them away quickly, as though trying to hide her emotions. It's not that simple, she said softly. There are things about your dad's past that he hasn't told you, things that he's ashamed of, and it's affecting everything right now. I could feel my heart drop in my chest. I didn't know what to think. What could be so bad about my dad's past that would affect his relationship with Melanie like this? I had never known him to be anything but loving and reliable, and now it seemed like there was this dark secret I had no idea about. Melanie, please, I said, my voice pleading. I need you to tell me. You're not the only one who's been affected by this. I'm his son, and I deserve to know the truth. She hesitated for a moment, clearly torn, but then she finally spoke. I wish I could, but your dad is the one who needs to tell you. It's not my place. I just want to protect you from the pain. I was silent for a moment, trying to process everything she had just said. It was clear that something major was happening, and I was no closer to understanding what it was. But I couldn't give up now. I had to know the truth, even if it meant facing something I wasn't ready for. I'm going to talk to him, I said, my voice filled with determination. I can't keep living in the dark about this. I need to hear it from him. Melanie didn't try to stop me. Instead, she just nodded, her face filled with a mix of sadness and regret. As I turned to leave, she called out softly, "Please, be gentle with him." I didn't respond. I didn't know how I could be gentle, not when the truth was waiting to shatter everything I thought I knew about my dad. But I knew it had to be done. I couldn't let this go on any longer. The truth had to come out, no matter how painful it might be. I walked toward my dad's study, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the weight of what I was about to uncover was almost unbearable. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, whether it was a confession or just a long, drawn-out explanation of why he had kept secrets from me for so long. All I knew was that I had to face it. I had to confront him, no matter how much it hurt. When I reached his office door, I paused. My hand hovered over the knob, and for a brief moment, I considered turning back. Maybe it wasn't too late to just let it go, to live in ignorance for a little while longer. But then I thought about everything that had led up to this point. The strange behavior, the late-night conversations, Melanie's cryptic words. I had to know. For my own peace of mind, I had to know. I pushed the door open, and there he was, sitting at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him. He looked up when he heard me enter, and I could see the surprise in his eyes. He wasn't expecting me, and that made it all the harder. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice a little shaky. "What's up?" I didn't waste any time with small talk. I didn't have the patience for it anymore. I took a deep breath, gathered all the courage I could muster, and asked the question that had been burning in my mind for days. "Dad, what's going on? Why didn't you tell me about your past? Why is everything so different with you and Melanie?" For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me, as if he were searching for the right words. I could see the guilt in his eyes, and that only made the situation feel worse. This was my dad, my hero, the man I had always looked up to, and now it seemed like everything I thought I knew about him was falling apart. He sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead as though trying to gather his thoughts. "I didn't want you to know, son," he said quietly. "I didn't want you to see me differently. I've spent my whole life trying to protect you from the things I've done, the mistakes I've made." I felt my chest tighten as I tried to process his words. Mistakes? What kind of mistakes? His eyes darted away from me, and I knew then that he was hiding something big, something so painful that he couldn't even look me in the eye as he said it. "Dad, please," I said, my voice breaking. "You can't keep hiding this from me. I need to know. I need to understand why things are the way they are with Melanie, why you've been acting so strange." He took a deep breath, and for the first time, I saw him break. His shoulders slumped, and I could tell that he was finally ready to tell me everything. I could hear the tremor in his voice as he spoke again, his words slow and heavy. "It's not just me and Melanie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's everything. I've been running from my past for years, hiding things from you, things that I didn't want you to know, things I didn't want to drag you into." I could feel my heart racing as I waited for him to continue. This was it, the moment of truth. "Years ago, before I met your mother, I was involved in some pretty bad stuff. Things that I can't take back. Things that could have destroyed me, destroyed all of us. I thought I could bury it all and move on, but it caught up to me. It caught up to all of us. That's why Melanie's been acting strange. She knows, she found out. And now, I'm afraid I've lost her." His words hit me like a freight train. My mind spun as I tried to make sense of what he was saying. My dad had a past so dark and complicated that it had been haunting him for years. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could I have not known? How could I have been so blind to everything that had been happening right under my nose? "I know it's hard to understand, but it's the truth," he said, his voice cracking. "I never wanted you to know. I never wanted you to see me as anything less than the man you thought I was. But I can't keep lying to you. I need you to know the truth, even if it hurts." I stood there, stunned and speechless. I couldn't process everything he had just said. My dad, this man I had looked up to all my life, was a stranger to me now. His past had been lurking in the shadows, and I had no idea how to move forward from this moment. As I stood there, my emotions warring inside me, I realized one thing. The truth was always more complicated than I had ever imagined, and no matter how much I wished things could go back to the way they were, there was no turning back now. My world had just shifted forever. It was a moment that I would never forget for as long as I lived. I looked at my son, the same boy I had raised with love, care, and countless sacrifices, now asking me the very question that was bound to change everything. "What was Grandpa really like, Mom?" His innocent words hit me like a freight train. I tried to control my breath, forcing myself to remain calm, but deep down, I knew that this question would lead to a conversation I had long avoided. The truth I had kept hidden for years now stood in front of me, demanding to be acknowledged. Your grandfather? I hesitated, searching for the right words. How could I explain something so painful, so heartbreaking? The man I had once admired and looked up to was now a distant memory, overshadowed by the secrets he had left behind. I took a deep breath and looked into my son's eyes, knowing there was no turning back. Your grandfather wasn't the person everyone thought he was, I finally said, my voice trembling. The room felt heavy, as though the weight of the past had descended upon us. My son, sensing the shift in the air, asked, "What do you mean?" I wanted to shield him, to protect him from the harsh realities of the truth, but I also knew that he was old enough to hear it, to understand the complexity of life and the people who shaped it. Your grandfather wasn't always a good man, I confessed, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. He had his demons, and he did things that I can never forgive. I saw my son's expression shift, his innocent face furrowing in confusion. What did he do, Mom? The question echoed in my mind, and for a moment, I wondered if I was ready to tell him the full extent of his grandfather's wrongdoings. But deep down, I knew this conversation was necessary. It was time for him to learn the truth. I took a deep breath, gathering the strength I needed to speak the truth. Your grandfather? He was involved in things that hurt people, things that, at the time, seemed unthinkable to me. My voice faltered, but I couldn't stop now. He wasn't just distant. He was hiding parts of himself that no one knew about. He made choices that tore apart families and left scars that never healed. I never wanted to believe it, but eventually, the truth was undeniable. My son stared at me, processing the weight of my words. He was so quiet, his young mind working to understand the gravity of what I had just told him. His eyes were wide, full of confusion and disbelief. But Grandpa was always so nice to me. I don't get it. How could he hurt people? I wanted to reach out and hold him, to tell him it wasn't his fault for not seeing it, for not knowing. I wanted to shield him from the reality of it all. But I knew that wouldn't do him any good. He had to understand the truth, no matter how painful it was. People are complicated, I said softly, my throat tight with emotion. They have both good and bad in them. Sometimes the bad part can take over, and it's easy to get lost in it. That's what happened to your grandfather. He made mistakes, huge ones, and he never took responsibility for them. But that doesn't mean you have to carry those same mistakes with you. You can make better choices. I could see the sadness in my son's eyes, the hurt that came from realizing that someone he loved wasn't who he thought they were. It was a look I knew all too well, the same look I had when I first learned the truth about my father. Does that mean we can't see Grandpa anymore? He asked quietly, his voice trembling. I swallowed hard, the question hanging in the air like an anchor. No, you can still see him. But it's important to understand that sometimes people have to face the consequences of their actions, and you need to decide for yourself what kind of person you want to be, regardless of what others do. I paused, taking a moment to collect myself before continuing. Your grandfather might still love you, but that doesn't mean he always did the right thing. You deserve to know that, to make your own decisions about who you want in your life. The room felt heavy again, like the silence itself was mourning the loss of something we could never get back. My son sat there, his gaze fixed on the floor, trying to process the storm of emotions that were now swirling in his mind. It was a lot for him to take in, and I could only hope he would understand when he was older. We sat there for a long time in silence, the weight of the conversation still hanging between us. My son's thoughts seemed so far away, and I wondered if he would ever fully comprehend what I had just shared. The pain in my heart was raw, a reminder of the fractured relationship I had with my own father, and I couldn't help but feel the echoes of those wounds reverberating in my chest. You don't have to forgive him right away, I said, breaking the silence softly. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel hurt, but just remember, forgiveness isn't for him. It's for you. You don't want to carry that weight around forever. He didn't respond, but I could see a flicker of something in his eyes, something that told me he was starting to understand. Maybe not fully, but enough to know that things weren't as simple as they seemed. As I watched him, I couldn't help but reflect on my own childhood. My father had been a complicated man, someone who I wanted to believe was good, but who was ultimately consumed by his own demons. And now, the same complicated legacy was being passed down to my son. It was a heavy burden for such a young heart, and I wished I could shield him from it all. But life didn't work that way, and I knew it. I had to teach him how to navigate the complexities of family, of love, and of forgiveness. It wasn't something that could be handed to him easily. It had to be learned, and sometimes that meant making difficult choices. Dad, my son said finally, breaking my train of thought, Do you think Grandpa will ever change? I sighed deeply, unsure of how to answer. I don't know, buddy. People don't always change. Sometimes they do, but it's not always in the way we hope. And even if he does, it doesn't erase the past. It's something you'll have to decide for yourself if you want him in your life or not. My son nodded slowly, and for a moment I thought he might cry, but instead he just leaned into me, his small body seeking comfort in the midst of all the confusion. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him close, feeling his breath against my chest. I didn't know if he would ever be the same after this conversation, if he would ever look at his grandfather the same way. But I hoped that one day he would find peace with it all, and that he would be able to make his own choices, independent of the legacy that had been passed down to him. As the days passed, I noticed a change in my son. He seemed quieter, more reflective, and I couldn't help but wonder if the conversation we had shared had planted a seed in his mind. He didn't bring it up again, but there were moments when I caught him staring off into space, lost in thought. I could only imagine what he was processing, the emotions that were likely swirling inside him, trying to make sense of everything. The tension in our family was palpable now. The weight of my father's absence, both physically and emotionally, was something none of us could ignore. The relationships we had once taken for granted were suddenly fragile, and it seemed like every word, every gesture, carried more meaning than it ever had before. I found myself constantly thinking about my own father, replaying the moments of our fractured relationship in my mind. What if I had said something different? What if I had tried harder to understand him? The questions haunted me, but I knew the answers would never come. My father had made his choices, and now I had to live with the consequences of those decisions. But it wasn't just me. My son was living with them too. One evening as we sat down for dinner, I noticed that my son had a distant look on his face. I set my fork down and glanced at him, hoping he would speak up. After a long silence, he finally broke the stillness. "Dad," he said quietly, "do you think Grandpa ever loved me?" The question took me by surprise. I had never really considered what my son might feel about his relationship with my father. I knew that my father had never been one to show affection, never one to express his love in the way most people would expect. But to hear my son ask that question with such vulnerability in his voice made my heart ache. "I don't know, buddy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Grandpa had a lot of trouble showing love, but that doesn't mean he didn't love you. Sometimes people just don't know how to show it." He nodded, but there was still a sadness in his eyes that I couldn't quite erase. "I wish he had told me," he murmured. I didn't have an answer for him. The truth was, I wasn't sure if my father ever truly understood the importance of love or connection. His inability to express it had cost him the relationships that could have healed him, and now it was affecting my son in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I'm sorry, kiddo," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I wish things had been different." My son looked at me, his eyes still filled with that unspoken sadness, but there was something else there now, something softer, more understanding. It was as if he had accepted that some things are beyond our control, that love, though vital, isn't always easy to give or receive. "You don't have to apologize, Dad," he said, his voice steady. "I understand. Maybe it's just how Grandpa was. He didn't know how to show it, but I know you love me, and that's what matters." His words hit me harder than anything else had over the past few weeks. For the first time, I realized that the emotional gap my father left behind didn't have to define me, nor did it have to impact my relationship with my son. My father's shortcomings didn't dictate how I should love my child. I had the power to change that narrative. "I do love you more than you'll ever know," I said, my voice filled with emotion. "And I'll make sure you always know it, every day." He smiled, a small but genuine smile, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't just about healing from the past anymore. It was about moving forward, about creating the kind of family I always wished I had. As the days went on, the atmosphere in our home began to shift. It was as if the heaviness we had all been carrying for so long had finally started to dissipate. My son seemed lighter, happier, and more at ease, and so did I. We didn't have all the answers, and the questions about my father still lingered, but now we were focusing on the present, the family we had built, the love we had for each other. And in that quiet moment, I realized something else. The pain from my father's absence, from his inability to show love, had made me a better father. I had learned from his mistakes, and I was determined not to repeat them. My son didn't need to ask for love, because I was always going to give it freely. We weren't perfect, but we had something stronger than anything my father and I had shared. We had understanding, we had forgiveness, and most importantly, we had each other.